Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the wind howled across the fjord, its icy fingers tearing through the village, biting the skin of those gathered along the rocky shore. Thorkel the Silent stood tall, his gaze fixed on the longship bobbing in the waves. The dragon-headed prow loomed over the waters, a symbol of strength and fury, and yet, for the first time in many years, Thorkel felt a tremor of doubt in his chest. "Thorkel," a voice called behind him. It was Ingvar, his old friend and most trusted ally. "The men are ready. We await only your word." Thorkel nodded, but he did not immediately respond. His eyes swept over the familiar landscape, the snow-dusted mountains, the dark forests thick with pine, and the familiar sounds of the village as they prepared for his departure. He had grown here, fought here, raised a family here. Now he was leaving it behind, with only the dream of a distant shore in his heart. Vinland. "You hesitate, my friend," Ingvar said softly, coming to stand beside him. "The gods have already blessed this journey. The omens were clear." Thorkel's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword, Skofnung, the heirloom of his family. "The omens may have been clear," he replied, his voice low and steady. "But I wonder if the gods have truly spoken. My father thought the same before he sailed for Vinland. He did not return." A silence settled between them, broken only by the crash of waves against the shore. Ingvar placed a hand on Thorkel's shoulder, his weathered face somber. "Your father was a brave man, and his dream of Vinland lives on through you. We will succeed where he could not. This time we are prepared. We have more men, more supplies, and more enemies among us." Thorkel interrupted, turning to look into Ingvar's eyes. "Olaf's ambition is no secret. He will not rest until this expedition is his to lead, and the men, some of them already whisper behind my back." Ingvar scowled at the mention of Olaf. "Olaf is a fool. The men follow you because they trust you, Thorkel. We will watch him closely. He will not threaten your command." Thorkel nodded, though the doubt still gnawed at him. He had led men before, across the seas, into battle, and through storms, where the gods themselves seemed to tear at their sails. But this? Vinland was different. It was a distant, wild place, spoken of in sagas, but never tamed. And in Olaf, he faced not only the treachery of the unknown land, but the rot of betrayal from within his own crew. "Enough talk of dark things," Thorkel said finally, his expression hardening as he cast off the doubts gnawing at him. "The gods will show us our fate. We sail today." Ingvar smiled, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "Aye, we sail today." He turned and barked orders to the crew. The men, hardened by years of battle and sea, began their final preparations. The smell of salt and seaweed filled the air, mingling with the sound of hammering, the creaking of wood, and the clatter of weapons. As Thorkel walked toward the ship, he was greeted by his daughter Astrid, who stood waiting at the edge of the pier. Her long golden hair was woven with beads of bone and shell, and her eyes, the same steely blue as his own, shimmered with both pride and sorrow. Beside her, Sigga, the expedition's healer, stood with a knowing smile, her raven-black hair stark against her pale skin. "You will return, father," Astrid said, though her voice trembled slightly. Thorkel stopped before her, placing his rough hands on her shoulders. "I will return, or my name will live in the songs of the skalds, carried on the wind to remind you of the strength that runs in your blood." Astrid blinked back tears and nodded, her jaw set in determination. She hugged him fiercely, and for a moment, Thorkel allowed himself the briefest indulgence of emotion. Then, pulling back, he glanced toward Sigga, whose calm gaze held something deeper, something unspoken. "You will look after her?" Thorkel said, more a command than a request. Sigga smiled faintly, her lips curling into a knowing expression. "Of course. Astrid is strong. She is her father's daughter, after all." Thorkel gave a final nod and turned toward the longship, where Olaf stood with his arms crossed, waiting. The second in command was a tall man, broader than Thorkel, but lacking the quiet strength that Thorkel commanded with his mere presence. Olaf's eyes gleamed with something darker, ambition, hunger. "We are ready to sail, Thorkel," Olaf said, his voice loud enough for the crew to hear, though there was an edge to his tone. "The men grow restless. They crave adventure. They crave the riches of Vinland." Thorkel studied Olaf for a moment, noting the subtle challenge in his words. "Then let them earn their riches through honor and strength," he replied coolly. "The gods favor those who act with wisdom, not haste." Olaf smirked, but said nothing more, turning to join the crew as they prepared to board. Thorkel climbed aboard the longship, his boots thudding against the wooden planks. The men cheered as he took his place at the helm, raising their axes and swords to the sky. The prow of the ship, carved into the fierce head of a dragon, pointed toward the horizon, and with a heave of oars, they began to move away from the shore. The sails unfurled, catching the wind, and the longship glided over the cold waters like a beast hungry for conquest. Thorkel stood at the bow, his hand gripping the railing as the village grew smaller behind them. His heart pounded with the weight of destiny. Ahead lay Vinland, a land rich with promise, or so the stories said. But it was also a land shrouded in mystery, where his father's bones likely lay, forgotten by all but the waves. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a blood-red glow across the sea, Ingvar joined Thorkel at the bow. "Do you believe we'll find what we seek?" Ingvar asked quietly. Thorkel's gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon. "The gods will decide," he said, "but whatever awaits us, we will face it with honor." Behind them, Olaf stood, his eyes gleaming with the flicker of the ship's torches. He smiled to himself, unseen by the others, and muttered under his breath, "Or we will take it by force." The longship cut through the waves, its dragon prow leading the way into the unknown, into a journey that would test the very souls of those aboard. Vinland awaited, but so too did the wolves within their own pack. And Thorkel knew all too well that both enemies would be equally dangerous. As the longship sailed into the fading light, Thorkel felt the weight of destiny settle upon his shoulders. Vinland was close. But with every oar stroke, the dangers, both external and internal, grew nearer, ready to strike. The wind swept across the unfamiliar shore, bringing with it the scent of pine and wet earth. Thorkel the Silent stood at the edge of the dense forest, staring into the wilds of Vinland. The trees were larger than anything he had seen in the lands of his birth, ancient giants that whispered secrets in the wind. This land was strange, vast, and untouched by the hands of men. Yet beneath its beauty, Thorkel sensed something darker, something waiting. Behind him, the camp was alive with the sounds of the Vikings setting up their new home. Shields clattered, axes cut into wood, and the crackling of fire punctuated the air. Despite the busyness, a sense of unease gnawed at the edges of the crew. They were far from home, and even as they built, the land itself seemed to push back against their presence. Thorkel turned at the sound of footsteps approaching. It was Ingvar, his face etched with concern. "The men grow restless," he said, his voice low, wary of being overheard. "They do not trust this place." Thorkel glanced at the camp, noting the furtive glances exchanged between the crew, their hands never far from their weapons. "Fear will always rise in the unknown," he replied. "But we will tame this land. We must. We have no choice now." Ingvar nodded, but remained silent. The trust he had in Thorkel was unshakable, but the growing tension in the camp was undeniable. It wasn't just the unfamiliar land that unsettled the men. It was the looming presence of Olaf. As if summoned by thought alone, Olaf emerged from the trees, his presence as commanding as ever. He was accompanied by several of his most loyal men, their faces grim and serious. "Thorkel," Olaf called, his tone almost jovial, though there was no warmth in it. "We have found something." Thorkel's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" Olaf gestured to one of his men who produced a crude wooden carving. It was a totem, a twisted figure of a face contorted in agony, its eyes gouged out, and its mouth open in a silent scream. "We found it deeper in the forest," Olaf said. "There are more. Strange things hang from the trees. Bones, feathers, things that no Viking would put there." Thorkel studied the totem in silence, his mind racing. He had heard tales of the Skrælings, the native people who lived in Vinland. His father had spoken of them before his doomed voyage. They were said to be fierce, protective of their land, and unforgiving to those who trespassed. Thorkel had hoped that they could avoid them, but it seemed the Skrælings were already watching. "The land is claimed," Thorkel said softly, his voice heavy with understanding. "We are not alone." Olaf's grin was wolfish. "Then we take what is ours. The men grow weary of hiding behind walls. They want to fight, to conquer, as we have always done." Thorkel turned to face him fully. "We are not here to destroy. We are here to build. You forget the purpose of this journey." Olaf's eyes darkened, and his smile faded. "I forget nothing, Thorkel, but you forget who we are. We are wolves. We take what we want, by force if necessary. If we wait too long, the Skrælings will strike first." For a moment, neither man spoke, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Around them, the men watched, tense and uncertain. Ingvar, standing at Thorkel's side, gripped the hilt of his sword, ready for whatever came next. "We will not strike unless they give us no choice," Thorkel said finally, his voice cold as winter. "We will build here, but we will not start a war." Olaf's lip curled in disdain, but he said nothing more. He turned and walked back toward his camp, his men following. As they disappeared into the shadows of the trees, Ingvar let out a slow breath. "He's going to be a problem," Ingvar said quietly. Thorkel nodded, watching Olaf's retreating figure. "Yes, but not yet." The day passed in heavy silence, and as dusk fell, the Vikings gathered around the fire. They spoke in hushed voices, sharing stories of past raids and adventures, but their eyes flickered constantly toward the dark forest beyond the camp. Even the bravest among them felt the weight of the unknown pressing in from all sides. Thorkel sat apart from the others, sharpening his axe by the fire's light. His mind churned with thoughts of Olaf, of the Skrælings, and of the responsibility that weighed on his shoulders. His father's expedition had ended in failure, his bones likely scattered somewhere in this very land. Thorkel had vowed that he would not meet the same fate, but doubt gnawed at him. He had brought these men here to build a new life, to tame the wild lands of Vinland. But now, more than ever, it seemed that the land itself was rejecting them. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, a rustling came from the edge of the camp. Thorkel was on his feet in an instant, his hand on his axe. The men around the fire scrambled for their weapons, eyes wide with alarm. From the darkness, figures emerged, tall, slender, and silent. The Skrælings had come. Thorkel held up a hand to his men, signaling them to stay their weapons. He stepped forward, his heart pounding. The Skrælings stood at the edge of the firelight, their faces painted in strange patterns, their eyes unreadable. They wore furs and leathers, and in their hands they carried weapons unlike anything the Vikings had seen before. Bows of bone and wood, spears tipped with sharpened stone. One of the Skrælings, clearly the leader, stepped forward. His eyes locked on Thorkel's, and though there were no words between them, the meaning was clear. This land was theirs, and the Vikings were trespassers. Thorkel lowered his axe, meeting the Skræling leader's gaze with calm determination. "We do not seek war," he said, his voice steady, though he knew they could not understand him. "We are here to build, not destroy." The Skræling leader's expression did not change. He glanced at the fire, at the Vikings gathered there and then back at Thorkel. Slowly, he raised his hand, palm out, in what Thorkel could only hope was a gesture of peace. The tension in the camp remained thick, but no one moved. The Skraelings stood, silent as shadows, waiting. Thorkel nodded slowly. He took a step forward, extending his hand in return, offering a token of peace. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, but before the Skraeling leader could respond, a sudden shout broke the stillness. "Now!" came the cry, and Olaf surged from the shadows with a group of his men, axes raised, their eyes wild with bloodlust. "No!" Thorkel roared, but it was too late. The Vikings crashed into the Skraelings, and the quiet night exploded into violence. Thorkel's heart sank as the sound of steel meeting flesh filled the air. The Skraelings fought back with skill and speed, but they were unprepared for the ferocity of Olaf's attack. Thorkel watched in horror as the fragile chance for peace crumbled before him. He leapt into the fray, trying to pull his men back, but the battle had already taken on a life of its own. Blood stained the earth of Vinland, and the woods echoed with the cries of the dying. When the last of the Skraelings had fled or fallen, Thorkel stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving with rage. Olaf stood nearby, grinning as he wiped his axe on his tunic. "We have claimed this land, Thorkel," Olaf said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Now it is ours." Thorkel's fists clenched, his eyes blazing with fury. "You've damned us all," he said, his voice low and cold. Olaf shrugged. "Damned or not, we are Vikings. We take what is ours." Thorkel turned away, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just been lost. Vinland, the land of promise, now ran red with blood. And the war that Thorkel had sought to avoid had already begun. The wolves had awoken and there would be no turning back. The morning after the battle dawned cold and gray, the sky a sea of iron clouds that hung heavy over the blood-stained earth. Thorkel stood at the edge of the camp, staring out into the trees where the Skraelings had fled. His body ached from the fight, but it was the weight in his chest that truly bore down on him. The weight of failure. The ground was slick with mud and blood. The bodies of the fallen Skraelings lay scattered across the camp, and the crows had already begun to circle, waiting for the dead to grow cold. Around him the men moved quietly, their eyes downcast as they piled the bodies into a pyre. There was no celebration of victory here, only the grim reality of what they had done. Ingvar approached, his face as grim as Thorkel's heart. "The bodies are almost cleared," he said quietly, his voice carrying the fatigue of a man who had seen too much death. "What should we do with them?" Thorkel clenched his jaw. "Burn them," he said, his voice hard. "We'll give them to the gods and hope they find peace in the next world." "And our own men?" Ingvar asked, his tone careful. "We bury them," Thorkel replied. "As is our way. We honor our dead." Ingvar nodded and turned to leave, but Thorkel stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "How many did we lose?" "5, Ingvar said, his voice rough with exhaustion. 3 more wounded. One of them might not make it." Thorkel's chest tightened. 5 men lost to a fight he hadn't wanted. He felt the weight of each death pressing down on him, his failure to stop Olaf's reckless attack gnawing at his conscience. The night replayed in his mind, Olaf's wild charge, the Skraelings' desperate defense, and the slaughter that followed. It hadn't been a battle. It had been a massacre. And now, there would be consequences. As if summoned by his thoughts, Olaf emerged from the center of the camp, his face still smeared with the blood of the previous night. He wore a broad, self-satisfied grin, as if the slaughter had brought him nothing but pride. Behind him, his men followed, their heads held high, emboldened by the bloodshed. Thorkel's blood simmered as he watched Olaf strut toward him. "Thorkel," Olaf greeted him, his voice light, almost mocking. "A fine morning, isn't it? We've driven the Skraelings away, claimed this land for our own, just as I said we would." Thorkel's jaw tightened. "You've claimed nothing but death," he said, his voice as cold as the morning air. "What you did last night was reckless and foolish. We were not ready for this fight, and now you've given the Skraelings every reason to come back in greater numbers." Olaf's smile faded, replaced with a sneer. "You think we should have sat on our hands while they watched us? They would have attacked us eventually. I just sped things along." Thorkel stepped forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over Olaf. "You acted without my command. You defied me, and men died because of it. You are not in charge here." Olaf's eyes darkened and he squared his shoulders, refusing to be cowed. "If I hadn't acted, we'd all be dead, waiting for the Skraelings to pick us off one by one. We are Vikings, Thorkel. We take what we want. We do not wait for permission from those too afraid to lead." Thorkel's hand itched for his axe, but he resisted the urge. He would not draw blood from his own people. Not yet. "You think you've won something here, Olaf?" he growled. "All you've done is invite death. The Skraelings will come back, and next time they won't be a small scouting party. They'll bring their warriors, and they'll come for every one of us." Olaf crossed his arms over his broad chest, his lips curling into a smirk. "Let them come. We'll crush them, just like we did last night." "Last night was not a victory," Thorkel thundered, his voice echoing through the camp. Every Viking turned to look, their faces filled with tension as the confrontation between their leaders unfolded. "You spilled blood on their land. They will not forget that." Olaf snorted, dismissing Thorkel with a wave of his hand. "You're too soft, Thorkel. That's your problem. You're too busy worrying about what the Skraelings think of us instead of leading your men like a true Viking. We are not settlers. We are warriors." Thorkel's chest heaved with the effort of holding back his rage. "We came here to build something, not to destroy everything in our path. You've forgotten our purpose. This is not about glory or conquest. It's about survival. If you don't understand that, then you are a danger to all of us." Olaf stepped closer, their faces now inches apart. "And you've forgotten who you are, Thorkel. You've forgotten what it means to be a Viking. If we do not take, we die. It's that simple." Thorkel's hand hovered over the hilt of his axe, his blood boiling. But before he could respond, Sigga, the healer, approached, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Thorkel, you need to see this." Reluctantly, Thorkel tore his gaze away from Olaf and followed Sigga toward the edge of the camp. She led him to the tent where the wounded men lay, their bodies pale and slick with sweat. The stench of blood and death hung in the air. One of the men, a younger warrior named Bjorn, was gasping for breath, his face twisted in pain. His chest had been pierced by a Skraeling spear, and the wound was already festering. "He's not going to make it," Sigga whispered, her face lined with worry. "I've done all I can, but the wound is too deep. His fever is rising." Thorkel knelt beside Bjorn, his heart heavy. The young man's eyes fluttered open and he struggled to speak. Did we win?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. Thorkel forced a small smile, though it felt like a betrayal. "We did, Bjorn. Rest now." Bjorn's lips curved into a faint smile before his eyes closed for the last time. Thorkel stood, feeling the weight of his failures pressing down on him. He turned to Sigga, his voice hoarse. "How long do you think we have?" Sigga's gaze flickered toward the forest. "The Skraelings will come for revenge, and soon. We may have a few days at most before they gather their forces. The question is, will we be ready?" Thorkel's mind raced. He had already lost too many men, and the wounds inflicted on his crew were more than just physical. Morale was low, and the looming threat of another attack gnawed at their resolve. "We'll fortify the camp," Thorkel said, his voice firm, though inside he doubted whether they had enough time or strength. "Set traps along the tree line, build a stronger wall. If they come, we'll be ready." Sigga nodded but did not hide the concern in her eyes. "And Olaf?" Thorkel's gaze darkened. "Olaf will be dealt with, but not yet. He has too many men loyal to him. I need to tread carefully." The next few days passed in a blur of feverish activity. The Vikings worked tirelessly, chopping down trees to reinforce the camp's defenses. Sigga tended to the wounded, but the losses weighed heavily on her, as they did on Thorkel. Every man they lost was another blow to their already fragile survival. Olaf, meanwhile, strutted through the camp like a victor, his men feeding on his arrogance and confidence. They sharpened their axes, laughed over the battle's spoils, and whispered that Thorkel was weak, that he no longer had the heart of a true Viking. But Thorkel remained focused. He had led men through storms and war before. He knew that brute force alone wouldn't save them. It was cunning that would win the day. As night fell on the third day, Thorkel stood on the newly built stockade, staring out into the darkness. He could feel it in his bones. The Skraelings were coming. They had tasted blood, and they would not stop until they had driven the Vikings from their land. He turned to Ingvar, who stood beside him, his face set with grim determination. "It's only a matter of time now," Thorkel said quietly. Ingvar nodded. "The men are ready. They'll fight when the time comes." Thorkel stared out into the blackness of the forest, his heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. "We'll need more than strength to survive this." And as the wind howled through the trees, Thorkel silently prayed to the gods for a miracle. Vinland would not give them peace, but Thorkel was determined not to let it take them without a fight. The camp was deathly still in the pale dawn light, the breath of the Vikings steaming in the cold air as they worked to finish the fortifications. Thorkel the Silent stood atop the newly raised wooden wall, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line. He could feel it, like the tension in a bowstring pulled taut. The Skraelings were out there, watching, waiting. His men moved quietly below, stacking wooden stakes into makeshift barriers and digging trenches in the frozen earth. The scars of the recent battle had left them hollow-eyed and cautious. Every crack of a branch in the forest made them flinch, their hands instinctively reaching for their axes. Ingvar appeared at Thorkel's side, his face drawn with weariness. "The defenses are nearly complete. The men are ready, but—" He hesitated, glancing down at the small camp below. "Their spirits are broken, Thorkel. The losses weigh heavy, and many whisper that we should leave this cursed land before it claims us all." Thorkel's jaw clenched as he scanned the faces of his warriors, once proud, now tired and grim. They had come to Vinland with dreams of conquest and prosperity, but the reality had proven far harsher. The land was wild, unforgiving, and now stained with the blood of both the Skraelings and their own men. "We stay," Thorkel said, his voice as firm as iron. "We build, we defend, and we survive. I will not lead them back across the sea as cowards, not while there is breath in me." Ingvar nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "And Olaf?" "His men grow bolder. They're already saying that he should lead, that you've led us to ruin." Thorkel's grip tightened on the hilt of his axe, the familiar weight of it grounding him. Olaf had been a thorn in his side since they set foot on Vinland, and now his ambition threatened the fragile order Thorkel had fought to maintain. "We'll deal with Olaf," Thorkel said, his voice low. "But first, we must deal with the Skraelings. One battle has not broken their will. They will return." As if on cue, a horn blast echoed from the tree line, long and mournful. Thorkel's heart leaped into his throat, and he signaled to the men below. "To the walls!" The camp sprang to life as the Vikings scrambled to their positions. Axes were drawn, shields hefted, and arrows notched. Thorkel's pulse quickened as he scanned the forest, waiting for the inevitable rush of Skraeling warriors. The trees rustled and a shadowy figure emerged from the undergrowth, but instead of the expected horde of attackers, a lone Skraeling stepped forward. He was tall and lean, his skin painted with swirling patterns of red and white. In his hand he held a spear, the tip gleaming in the faint light. "Hold!" Thorkel barked, raising his hand to still his men. He narrowed his eyes, watching as the Skraeling stood motionless, his gaze locked on the Viking camp. Ingvar leaned close to Thorkel. "What is he doing? A challenge?" "I don't know," Thorkel murmured. His instincts told him to be cautious, but there was something different about this, something deliberate. The Skraeling raised his spear and drove it into the ground, leaving it standing upright as he stepped back. Then he spoke, his words strange and guttural, yet they carried an unmistakable meaning. "He wants to parley," Thorkel said, frowning. "The Skraelings are offering terms." Ingvar's brow furrowed. "Terms? After what happened? They should be ready to strike us down." Thorkel was silent for a moment, his mind racing. This was unexpected. After Olaf's reckless attack, he had expected nothing but vengeance from the Skraelings. But this was different. They were giving him an opportunity. "We'll meet them," Thorkel said, his decision made. "But not here. I'll not have them within our walls." Ingvar's eyes widened. "You can't trust them, Thorkel. It could be a trap." "It could be," Thorkel agreed. "But if they wanted to kill us, they would have done it by now. They're offering something else." Before Ingvar could protest further, Thorkel raised his voice, calling down to the camp. "Sigga, I need you with me." Sigga, the healer, stepped forward from where she had been tending to one of the wounded men. Her raven-black hair caught the light, and her sharp, calculating eyes met Thorkel's. "What do you need?" "You're coming with me to meet the Skraelings," Thorkel said. "If it's a trick, I'll need your eyes. You've seen more battles than any of us." Sigga nodded, grabbing her staff. "Let's hope they're more interested in talking than fighting." As they left the camp and moved toward the tree line, Thorkel could feel the eyes of the Vikings on his back, their uncertainty palpable. Even Ingvar's usual calm had cracked under the weight of the unknown. But Thorkel's resolve had hardened. He would not let this chance slip away, even if it meant putting his life in the hands of his enemies. When they reached the edge of the forest, the Skraeling stood waiting. He spoke again, his voice sharp and commanding, gesturing for Thorkel and Sigga to follow him. "Stay close," Thorkel murmured to Sigga, and they followed the Skraeling deeper into the woods. The air was thick with tension, the sounds of the forest muted as they walked in silence. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the land itself was watching, waiting for them to make a misstep. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a clearing. More Skraelings were there, perhaps a dozen, all armed and watching them with cold, hard eyes. Among them stood an elder, his long white hair braided and his face etched with the lines of age. He stepped forward, his presence commanding despite his age, and spoke in the guttural tongue of the Skraelings. Thorkel didn't understand the words, but the intent was clear enough. Sigga stepped forward, speaking slowly and deliberately in the language of trade, hoping the elder might understand. "We come to speak of peace." The elder studied them in silence, his dark eyes unreadable, but something deeper stirred within him, a flame that refused to be snuffed out even in the face of death. "We will not leave," Thorkel said, his voice steady and resolute. "This land is ours now. We will defend it." The elder's eyes narrowed as Sigga translated Thorkel's words. There was no anger in the elder's expression, only cold understanding. He nodded once, then turned and disappeared into the forest with his warriors, leaving Thorkel and Sigga alone in the clearing. As they made their way back to the camp, Thorkel's heart pounded with the weight of what he had just done. War was inevitable now, and there would be no turning back. When they reached the camp, Olaf was waiting, a smug grin on his face. "Well?" Olaf asked, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Did they offer to surrender?" Thorkel's gaze hardened. "No, they offered us a choice, and I made mine." Olaf raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "And what choice was that?" "We stay," Thorkel said firmly, "and we fight." Olaf's grin widened, and Thorkel felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. Olaf would welcome this war, relishing the chance to prove his strength and take control. But as Thorkel looked around at his men, their faces a mixture of fear and determination, he knew that this was his fight, his war to lead. The wolves of Vinland had awakened, and the bloodshed was far from over. Vinland would be won or lost by the axe, and Thorkel the Silent would not retreat. The wind screamed through the camp, sending the fire's embers spiraling into the night sky. Thorkel the Silent stood by the flames, his shadow cast long and dark across the frozen earth. Around him, his men slept fitfully, restless in the knowledge of the inevitable war to come. The Skraelings would return, and when they did, they would not come as a few scattered warriors. They would come as a storm. Thorkel had just finished a long night of planning with Ingvar and Sigga, going over their defenses and preparing for the fight that lay ahead. But now, as the fire crackled and the stars blinked down from the heavens, a cold unease gnawed at him. It was not just the threat of the Skraelings that weighed heavy on his heart. It was Olaf. Thorkel had felt it building for days. The way Olaf's men gathered in small, secretive groups. The way Olaf's eyes gleamed with a hunger that had nothing to do with food or survival. He had watched Olaf's influence grow, had heard the whispers of discontent, of doubt in his own leadership. The air itself seemed thick with tension, ready to snap. From the shadows, Sigga approached, her raven-black hair shifting in the wind. Her sharp eyes glittered in the firelight as she studied Thorkel's face. "You're worried," she said softly, her voice like a low murmur in the night. Thorkel didn't respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, where the dark outline of the forest loomed like a wall of shadows. "It's not just the Skraelings," he said finally, his voice gruff with the weight of his thoughts. "Olaf?" Sigga asked, her tone knowing. Thorkel nodded. "He grows bolder. I can feel it. He thinks he can take what's mine." Sigga's lips thinned into a grim line. "He won't wait much longer. His men are restless, and so is he. If you don't act soon, he will." Before Thorkel could respond, the distant sound of raised voices broke the stillness of the camp. A shout rang out, followed by the unmistakable clatter of steel against steel. Thorkel's muscles tensed. He knew immediately what it meant. "Stay here," Thorkel growled to Sigga as he grabbed his axe and strode toward the source of the commotion. But Sigga followed him anyway, her staff in hand, her face set with grim determination. As they neared the center of the camp, the sounds of fighting grew louder. A circle of men had formed, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Thorkel pushed his way through the crowd and was met with a sight that confirmed his worst fears. Two of his men were locked in a brutal struggle, their swords flashing in the firelight. One of them was Harold, one of Thorkel's most loyal warriors. The other was a broad-shouldered brute named Eric, one of Olaf's men. The crowd roared as the two clashed, their weapons ringing out in the cold night air. But this wasn't just a fight over a petty squabble. This was something far more dangerous. This was a challenge to Thorkel's authority. Thorkel's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Enough!" The crowd fell silent as Thorkel stepped forward, his eyes blazing with fury. Harold staggered back, blood trickling from a gash on his arm, but his gaze never wavered from Eric, who stood breathing heavily, his sword still raised. Olaf stepped out of the crowd then, his arms crossed over his chest, his lips twisted into a smirk. "It seems your men can't keep their tempers in check, Thorkel," Olaf said, his voice oozing with false concern. Thorkel's jaw clenched. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Harold, still panting from the fight, spoke up. "Eric insulted your name, Jarl. He said we should follow Olaf instead. I couldn't let that stand." Olaf's smirk grew wider. "It's true." Eric merely spoke what many of the men are already thinking. "You've led us into this cursed land, Thorkel, and all we've found is death and danger. Maybe it's time for new leadership." Thorkel's grip tightened on his axe. The tension in the camp was palpable, the men shifting uneasily as they watched the confrontation unfold. It was a dangerous moment, one wrong move, and the camp could descend into chaos. "This is not the time for division," Thorkel growled, his voice low and dangerous. "We stand on the brink of war with the Skraelings. If we fight amongst ourselves, we are all doomed." Olaf's eyes gleamed with the hunger for power. "You speak of war, but it is you who brought us to this point. The men followed you here to claim Vinland, not to die in this forsaken wilderness. You've led us to ruin." Thorkel's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained cold, unreadable. He knew what Olaf was doing, sowing dissent, trying to fracture his authority. He had to shut this down now. "We are Vikings," Thorkel said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "We came here to build something, not to tear each other apart. If you doubt me, then challenge me. Face me as a Viking would and let the gods decide." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on Olaf. A slow smile spread across Olaf's face, and he stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "A challenge, then," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Let the gods decide who is fit to lead." Thorkel's gaze never wavered from Olaf's as he stepped forward. "Tomorrow at dawn," he said, "we settle this." The tension was suffocating, the weight of the coming conflict hanging heavy over the camp. The men began to disperse, some whispering excitedly, others casting wary glances at Thorkel and Olaf. Sigga lingered by Thorkel's side, her face tight with concern. "This isn't just a challenge, Thorkel, this is a trap. Olaf has been planning this for a long time." "I know," Thorkel said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "But I won't back down. If I run now, I lose everything." Sigga placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm. "Olaf is dangerous. He's a brute, but he's clever. Be careful." Thorkel met her gaze, his eyes filled with the same cold determination that had earned him his name. "I've faced worse than Olaf." The night passed in an uneasy silence, the camp holding its breath in anticipation of the coming dawn. Thorkel spent the hours sharpening his axe, his thoughts focused and clear. He had known this moment would come, the moment when Olaf would make his move. The only question was whether Thorkel could stop him before everything fell apart. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the camp gathered around the makeshift arena, a flat stretch of earth between the campfires, where so many Viking disputes had been settled with blood and steel. Thorkel stood on one side, his axe gleaming in the pale light. Olaf stood opposite him, his sword drawn, a hungry gleam in his eyes. "Let this be decided here," Thorkel called, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "No matter the outcome, we will not tear this camp apart. We face the Skraelings united." Olaf smirked. "We'll see who's left to lead." With a roar, Olaf charged, his sword flashing in a deadly arc. Thorkel sidestepped, his axe coming up to deflect the blow. The sound of steel meeting steel rang out, and the crowd gasped as the two leaders clashed with a fury that shook the ground beneath them. The fight was brutal, the raw power of Olaf pitted against Thorkel's skill and precision. Olaf fought with reckless abandon, his strikes wild and powerful. But Thorkel's movements were calculated, each parry and strike aimed with deadly purpose. For what felt like an eternity they fought, the clash of weapons filling the cold morning air. Blood spattered the ground as each man landed blows, but neither would give an inch. Finally, with a swift movement, Thorkel saw his opening. Olaf's overconfidence had left him exposed, and Thorkel swung his axe in a powerful arc, the blade biting deep into Olaf's side. Olaf stumbled back, blood pouring from the wound, his face twisted in shock and pain. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath as he clutched his side. Thorkel stood over him, his chest heaving, his axe dripping with blood. "It's over, Olaf," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "Yield." For a moment Olaf glared up at him, his eyes blazing with hatred. But then the fire dimmed, and he slumped to the ground, defeated. The crowd stood in stunned silence as Thorkel lowered his axe. "This is the fate of those who challenge the gods and fail," he said, his voice carrying across the camp. "Let this be the end of our division." As the men carried Olaf's body away, Thorkel looked out over the camp, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the true battle still lay ahead. The Skraelings were coming, and now, with Olaf's coup behind him, Thorkel knew that he had to be stronger than ever to survive. The wolves of Vinland would have their reckoning, but Thorkel would lead them through it, no matter the cost. The air was thick with anticipation. Every breath Thorkel took seemed to hang in his chest. the weight of the camp's gaze pressing against him. Olaf's blood still darkened the earth from the previous day's duel, but the whispers of his rebellion had died along with him. For now, the camp was unified behind Thorkel, but it was a fragile peace, one that would be tested in ways even Olaf hadn't imagined. Thorkel stood atop the newly built stockade, his hands gripping the cold wood as he surveyed the tree line. His men worked tirelessly below, sharpening stakes, reinforcing barricades, and checking their weapons. The camp was quieter now, the tension humming beneath every movement, every glance exchanged. Everyone knew what was coming. The Skraelings would not forgive the bloodshed that had stained their land. Ingvar approached, his brow furrowed in worry. "The men are ready as they can be, but there's a nervousness in the air," he said, his voice low. "They've seen what the Skraelings can do, and without Olaf's men stirring up trouble, they're starting to realize what we're truly up against." Thorkel didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the trees. "They should be nervous," he said quietly. "We've killed their kin, and they will come for us. It's only a matter of when." Ingvar nodded, the lines of age and fatigue deepening on his face. "How many do you think they'll send?" "As many as it takes," Thorkel replied, his voice grim. "They know these lands better than we do. They'll strike when we least expect it, and they won't stop until they've driven us into the sea." There was a long pause, the silence broken only by the sound of hammers striking wood and the distant cawing of crows. Ingvar shifted uneasily beside him. "And when they do come, do you think we can hold them off?" Thorkel turned to face his friend, his eyes cold but resolute. "We don't have a choice. This is our home now. We either defend it or die." Ingvar sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "Aye, but the men are worn thin, and if they sense weakness in you—" "There is no weakness in me," Thorkel interrupted, his voice hard as steel. "I know what has to be done, and when the Skraelings come, I will lead them into the fire. The gods will decide if we are to live or die." Ingvar nodded, though his worry remained. "Very well. But we should keep a close watch tonight. I don't trust the silence. It's too still." As if on cue, a rustling echoed from the woods, faint but distinct. Thorkel's heart pounded in his chest, his hand flying to the hilt of his axe. He strained to hear, every muscle in his body taut. And then, the horn sounded. It was long and low, a deep, mournful note that seemed to carry on the wind, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Thorkel's blood ran cold as the sound echoed across the camp, and his eyes snapped to the tree line just as the first Skraeling warriors emerged from the forest, silent and deadly. "They're here!" Thorkel roared, his voice cutting through the camp. "To the walls! All men to the walls!" Chaos erupted as the Vikings scrambled for their weapons, rushing to the barricades as the Skraelings surged forward from the woods. They moved swiftly, their bodies painted with war paint, and their eyes gleaming with the promise of blood. Some carried bows, others wielded spears and axes of stone. They were fewer in number than Thorkel had feared, but they fought with the ferocity of wolves, their movements fluid and precise. Thorkel leaped from the stockade, landing heavily in the dirt below. He grabbed his axe, Skofnung, its edge gleaming in the pale light. "Hold the line," he bellowed, rallying his men. "They will not break us." The first wave of Skraelings reached the wooden barricades, their war cries piercing the air. Arrows flew from their ranks, thudding into the wooden walls and shields of the Vikings. Thorkel saw a man beside him fall, an arrow lodged in his neck, but there was no time to grieve. He rushed to the barricade, standing shoulder to shoulder with his men as the Skraelings began to scale the defenses. A warrior lunged at him from above, his spear aimed for Thorkel's chest. Thorkel swung his axe in a wide arc, the blade connecting with the Skraeling's weapon, sending it clattering to the ground. With a quick, brutal movement, Thorkel drove the edge of his axe into the man's side, the sickening sound of bone and flesh giving way. But there were more, so many more. They came in waves, battering against the Viking defenses like the relentless tide. Thorkel fought fiercely, every swing of his axe fueled by desperation and rage. The Skraelings were smaller, faster, but Thorkel's strength and skill made up for their agility. Around him his men fought bravely, but he could see the cracks beginning to form. The Vikings were outnumbered and outmatched. "Ingvar!" Thorkel shouted over the din of battle, searching for his friend in the chaos. "Fall back to the inner walls. We can't hold them here." Ingvar appeared, blood streaming from a cut on his brow, his face grim. "If we fall back, they'll push us into the heart of the camp. We won't have anywhere left to retreat." Thorkel knew he was right, but they couldn't hold the outer barricades much longer. Already, he could see Skraelings slipping through the gaps, cutting down men with ruthless efficiency. "We'll make our stand there," Thorkel growled. "It's the only chance we have. Go." Reluctantly, Ingvar nodded and began shouting orders to the remaining men. Slowly, the Vikings retreated, pulling back toward the center of the camp where the last of their defenses stood. The Skraelings followed, relentless in their pursuit. Thorkel was the last to retreat, covering his men's escape as he swung his axe in a deadly arc. His muscles burned with exhaustion, his arms heavy from the weight of the battle. But he would not stop. Not yet. Not while there was still breath in his lungs. As they reached the inner barricade, Sigga appeared at Thorkel's side, her face pale but determined. She had a bow in hand, loosing arrows into the advancing Skraelings with deadly precision. "They're too many," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the clash of steel and the cries of battle. "We won't last much longer." Thorkel knew she was right. The Skraelings were relentless, and for everyone they killed, 2 more seemed to take their place. They were like shadows, slipping through the gaps in their defenses, striking without warning, but they had no choice. "Hold the line!" Thorkel roared again, his voice hoarse with exertion. "We fight for our lives, we fight for Vinland." His words rallied the remaining men, and they formed a tight shield wall around the heart of the camp. The Skraelings crashed into them again, but this time, the Vikings held firm. Axes and swords clashed in a storm of violence, the ground beneath them slick with blood. Thorkel's world narrowed to the space in front of him, the flash of a Skraeling's blade, the arc of his axe, the thud of bodies falling to the earth. Too, every strike was a prayer to the gods, every breath a defiance of death. But then, just as the battle seemed on the verge of breaking them, something changed. A sharp whistle cut through the air, and the Skraeling warriors paused, their movements halting as if by command. Thorkel, panting and bloodied, froze, his eyes widening in confusion. The Skraeling leader, a tall figure with feathers woven into his hair and a bone necklace hanging around his neck, raised his hand. Slowly, methodically, the Skraelings began to retreat, slipping back into the shadows of the forest as silently as they had come. Thorkel watched, his heart still pounding in his chest, as the last of the Skraelings disappeared into the trees. It was as though they had never been there at all. The battle had ended as abruptly as it had begun. But the question hung in the air. Why? Ingvar staggered to Thorkel's side, his face streaked with blood and dirt. What just happened? Thorkel shook his head, his grip still tight on his axe. I don't know. But this isn't over. Sigga, breathing heavily beside them, nodded grimly. They're testing us. This was only the beginning. The camp was silent now, the only sound the ragged breathing of the survivors. The dead littered the ground around them, a grim testament to the brutality of the Skraeling attack. But Thorkel knew the truth. The Skraelings would return, and when they did, they would come with the full force of their fury. The wolves of Vinland had survived the night, but the true battle was still to come. The night was a blanket of darkness, heavy and suffocating, pierced only by the flickering light of torches around the Viking camp. The silence after the Skraeling retreat was unnerving, a void that filled the air with a sense of impending doom. Thorkel the Silent paced slowly through the camp, his steps heavy with the weight of what had transpired. His men were weary, bloodied and bruised from the attack that had nearly broken them. But Thorkel knew, deep in his bones, that the Skraelings weren't finished. The retreat had not been a sign of defeat, but a calculated move, a warning that they would return with greater numbers, more fury. This brief respite was a cruel mercy, one meant to test their will. Thorkel had gathered his most trusted warriors around a fire in the center of the camp. Their faces, shadowed in the dancing light, were etched with exhaustion, fear, and anger. Ingvar sat closest to Thorkel, his hand still resting on the hilt of his sword, as if expecting the battle to resume at any moment. Sigga stood beside them, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon, always alert. "We can't survive another attack like that," Ingvar said, his voice low but grim. "Our walls held but barely. The next time they come, we won't have the strength to push them back." Thorkel's jaw tightened as he stared into the flames. He knew Ingvar spoke the truth. The men were tired, the defenses stretched too thin. The death toll was climbing and morale was faltering. Worse still, there was no way to know when the Skraelings would strike again. "We need to regroup, fortify what we can," Sigga said, her voice calm despite the tension in the air. "We still have supplies and the men need rest. If we're to have any chance, we need every man standing when they return." Thorkel nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. His mind raced, trying to find a path forward, a way to hold out long enough to weather this storm. But even as he considered their options, the truth gnawed at him. There were few paths left, and each one led to the same inevitable end: more death. Ingvar broke the silence, his voice rough with fatigue. "We can't keep this up forever, Thorkel. Not unless we find a way to stop them for good." Thorkel looked up, meeting Ingvar's gaze. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps. It was a rare thing to see in a man like Ingvar, who had stood beside him through so many battles. But doubt was a poison that spread quickly, especially in the face of impossible odds. "We need to stop reacting," Thorkel said, his voice cold and measured. "We can't wait for them to come to us again. We need to take the fight to them." The warriors around him stiffened, exchanging wary glances. Ingvar frowned. "Are you saying we should march into their territory? Into the woods where they know every path and we know none?" Thorkel's eyes hardened. "If we wait here, we die. We've been on the defensive for too long. If we can strike before they're ready, if we can take out their leaders, we might stand a chance. Otherwise, we'll be picked off one by one, no matter how high we build these walls." The men muttered among themselves, but Thorkel's words struck a chord. There was truth in them, as brutal as it was. Sigga watched Thorkel closely, her expression unreadable. "You're proposing a raid," she said, stepping closer. "But this isn't like attacking a rival Viking camp. The Skraelings fight differently. They don't meet you head on. They'll draw us in, surround us, and pick us off like wolves hunting prey." Thorkel met her gaze, his voice low and fierce. "Then we hunt like wolves ourselves." A heavy silence followed his words. The fire crackled, casting shadows on their faces, and for a moment, no one spoke. Thorkel could see the doubt in their eyes, the fear of marching into the unknown, of facing an enemy they did not fully understand. But he could also see the spark of determination, the need to act before it was too late. Ingvar was the first to speak. "We'll need to move quickly, quietly. If we're going to hit them, we need to strike hard and fast before they realize what's happening." Thorkel nodded. "We leave before dawn. A small group, only the strongest and most skilled. The rest will stay here and fortify the camp as best they can. When we return, we'll need every man ready to fight." Sigga crossed her arms, her gaze still locked on Thorkel. "And if you don't return?" Thorkel didn't hesitate. "Then you'll know to expect the worst." The warriors exchanged grim looks, but none of them objected. They knew what was at stake, and they knew there was no other option. To stay in the camp and wait for death was not the Viking way. They would meet their fate head-on, with steel in hand and fire in their hearts. As the others dispersed to make preparations, Ingvar lingered beside Thorkel. "You're sure about this?" he asked quietly. "If we fail—" "We won't fail," Thorkel interrupted, though his voice was tight. He knew the risks better than anyone, but he also knew that they were out of time. The next strike would come, and if they weren't ready, it would be their last. Ingvar nodded slowly, his eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. Then we fight, my friend. To the end. Thorkel clasped Ingvar's arm in a warrior's grip, a silent oath passing between them. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The camp was quiet in the hours before dawn, the air thick with the smell of smoke and fear. Thorkel and his chosen warriors moved through the darkness, their movements silent and deliberate. There were only 10 of them, hand-picked for their strength and skill. Among them were Ingvar and Sigga, their faces set with determination. They slipped into the forest, the sounds of the camp fading behind them as the trees closed in. The air was cold, and the ground was uneven beneath their feet. But Thorkel moved with purpose. Every step took them deeper into Skraeling territory, into the heart of enemy land. The forest was thick with shadows, every rustling leaf and snapping twig a reminder that they were being watched. The plan was simple: strike the Skraeling camp before they could regroup, take out their leaders and scatter their forces. But the execution would be far more dangerous. The Skraelings were masters of this land, and every step the Vikings took was a step into the unknown. Sigga walked beside Thorkel, her eyes sharp as she scanned the forest around them. "We're being watched," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Thorkel nodded. "I know, but they won't attack until they're sure they can win." They continued in silence, every warrior on edge. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees looming like silent sentinels. And then, in the distance, Thorkel saw it, a faint glow, barely visible through the trees. The Skraeling camp. He signaled for the others to stop, his heart pounding in his chest. "We're close," he whispered, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Spread out. We'll circle around and hit them from all sides. No mercy." The warriors nodded, their faces grim with resolve. They fanned out, disappearing into the shadows as they prepared for the attack. Thorkel gripped his axe, his fingers cold against the wood. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Everything they had fought for, everything they had bled for, was riding on this. For a long moment, the forest was silent, the only sound the distant crackle of the Skraeling fire. And then, with a roar that shook the trees, Thorkel charged. The first Skraeling didn't even see him coming. Thorkel's axe cleaved through the air, and the man fell with a sickening thud. The camp erupted into chaos, shouts and screams filling the night as the Vikings descended upon them like a storm. Thorkel moved like a force of nature, his axe cutting down every foe that dared stand in his way. But the Skraelings were fierce, and they fought back with a fury that matched the Vikings blow for blow. Arrows whistled through the air, spears flashed in the firelight, and the forest became a battlefield of blood and steel. Thorkel's heart pounded in his chest, his muscles burning with every strike. He fought with everything he had, knowing that this was their only chance. Around him, his warriors fought valiantly, but the Skraelings were many, and they seemed to rise from the shadows themselves. Through the chaos, Thorkel caught sight of the Skraeling leader, the one who had spoken to him before the retreat. He was shouting orders, his eyes blazing with hatred. Thorkel knew that if he could take him down, the battle would turn in their favor. With a snarl, Thorkel charged toward him, his axe raised high. But just as he reached the leader, a sharp pain exploded in his side. He staggered, gasping, and looked down to see the shaft of a spear protruding from his ribs. His vision blurred, and for a moment the world seemed to spin around him. But Thorkel was a Viking, and he would not fall so easily. With a roar of defiance, he ripped the spear from his side and swung his axe in a wide arc, catching the Skraeling leader across the chest. The man fell with a cry, blood pouring from the wound, and the Skraelings faltered, their momentum broken. Thorkel swayed on his feet, his breath ragged, but he raised his axe once more. "For Vinland!" he shouted, his voice hoarse but filled with fury. His warriors rallied around him, their spirits lifted by the sight of their Jarl still standing, still fighting. The Skraelings hesitated, their lines breaking as panic set in. One by one they began to retreat, slipping back into the shadows of the forest. Thorkel stood amidst the wreckage of the battle, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. But he had won. They had won. The Vikings had struck back. But as Thorkel stared into the darkness where the Skraelings had disappeared, he knew the war was far from over. This was only a small victory, a temporary reprieve. The wolves of Vinland had drawn blood once again, but the storm was still gathering. And the final reckoning was yet to come. The camp was quiet in the aftermath of the battle. The once boisterous sound of hammers striking wood, the ringing of swords, and the laughter of men had been replaced by the solemn murmur of the wounded and the soft shuffle of feet over frozen earth. Thorkel the Silent sat by the central fire, his hand pressed to the bandage wrapped around his ribs. The pain from the spear wound throbbed with every breath, but he had endured worse. His body might have been battered, but his spirit was unbroken. Yet as he gazed around the camp, the weight of their victory hung heavy on his shoulders. They had struck back at the Skraelings and driven them from the forest, but it had come at a great cost. The Vikings were fewer now, their numbers dwindling with each passing day, and the shadow of death loomed over them all. Men who had once followed him without question now cast furtive glances, doubt growing in their hearts like a poison. Sigga knelt by the fire, grinding herbs into a poultice, her face drawn with exhaustion. She had been tending to the wounded non-stop since their return. The sharp scent of healing herbs mingled with the bitter smoke from the fire, and every now and then Thorkel could hear the groan of a man in pain. "You should rest," Sigga said, not looking up as she worked. "You're no good to anyone if you fall from that wound." Thorkel grunted, his hand still pressed against his ribs. "There'll be time to rest when this is over." Sigga glanced up, her dark eyes flashing with frustration. "If you don't rest, it'll be over sooner than you think. That spear was deep. You were lucky it didn't hit anything vital. But if you push yourself too hard, you won't live to see the next battle." Thorkel didn't respond, his gaze distant as he stared into the flames. He knew she was right. But the thought of resting while his men struggled to survive gnawed at him. Every moment of inaction felt like a betrayal to those who had already died. Bjorn, Harold, and so many others. They had followed him into this land, and now their bones lay beneath the cold earth of Vinland. A hand clapped on his shoulder, and Thorkel looked up to see Ingvar standing over him, his weathered face creased with concern. "She's right, you know. You've earned some rest, Thorkel. You can't lead us if you're dead." Thorkel exhaled through his nose, a thin smile playing at his lips. "Since when did you start listening to healers?" Ingvar chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Since she's the only one keeping half our men alive." There was a brief pause as Ingvar sat down beside him, his eyes following the flickering flames. The firelight danced across the sharp lines of his face, and for the first time, Thorkel saw the deep weariness in his friend's eyes, the exhaustion that came not just from battle, but from the relentless weight of leadership. "How many did we lose?" Thorkel asked quietly. Though he already knew the answer would be grim, Ingvar's jaw tightened. 10 men dead, another 5 too wounded to fight. That leaves us with barely enough to hold the camp if the Skraelings come back. "They will come back," Thorkel said, his voice hard. "And when they do, it'll be with everything they have." The silence that followed was heavy, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Thorkel could feel the weight of his own words pressing down on him. The Skraelings were not defeated. Their retreat had been a tactical withdrawal, not a rout. The next time they struck, it would be the end, unless Thorkel found a way to turn the tide. Ingvar glanced at him sideways. "What are you thinking, Thorkel?" Thorkel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. "We can't stay here," he said finally. "Not like this. The Skraelings know where we are, and they'll come back stronger. We need to move, find higher ground, somewhere defensible." Ingvar frowned. "Move the camp? In this state? Half the men can barely stand, and winter's coming. We won't survive the cold out there." Thorkel's gaze hardened. If we stay here, we won't survive the Skraelings. They know every path through the forest, every weakness in our defenses. If we want to survive, we need to be smarter than them. We need to make our stand somewhere they can't reach us. Sigga had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up, her voice calm but firm. Thorkel, the men are in no condition to march. Some of them won't survive the journey. They need time to heal, time to regain their strength. Thorkel's frustration boiled over, and he slammed his fist into the ground. We don't have time. We're running out of food, out of men. The Skraelings will come, and when they do, they'll wipe us out if we're not ready. Sigga's gaze didn't waver, her voice unwavering. You can't fight an enemy when you're already half dead. If you push them too hard now, you'll lose more men to exhaustion than to the Skraelings. Thorkel glared at the fire, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. She was right, of course. Pushing the men to move now, when they were so broken, could lead to disaster. But staying in the camp felt like waiting to die. Every second they lingered here was another second the Skraelings had to prepare, to gather their forces for a final strike. Ingvar spoke up again, his voice thoughtful. There might be another way. Thorkel turned to him, his brow furrowing. What are you thinking? There's a place, Ingvar said slowly, as if weighing the idea in his mind. A ridge to the north. It's high ground, defensible, with enough space for us to build a new camp. The Skraelings wouldn't be able to surround us there. Thorkel considered it for a moment, his mind racing. It was risky. Moving the men, many of whom were barely able to walk, to a new location would be a gamble, but it was a gamble they might have to take. Can we make it? Thorkel asked, his voice heavy with uncertainty. Ingvar nodded. If we go slowly, carefully, it'll take time, but we can make it. Sigga's voice was softer now, more conciliatory. We can take the strongest first, those who can walk on their own. The wounded can follow later when they're stronger. But if we leave now, we leave many of them behind. Thorkel's chest tightened. It was a hard choice, one that weighed heavy on his soul. But he had led these men here, into the heart of Vinland, and he could not abandon them, no matter how broken they were. I'll not leave anyone behind, Thorkel said, his voice resolute. We'll move together. Slowly if we have to, but we go as one. Ingvar and Sigga exchanged a glance, then nodded. Then we'll prepare the men, Ingvar said. We leave at first light. Thorkel nodded, though the knot of doubt still twisted in his chest. Moving the camp was dangerous, but staying here, waiting for the Skraelings to strike again, was suicide. If they were to have any hope of survival, they needed to find higher ground, a place where they could defend themselves. As Ingvar and Sigga walked away to gather the men, Thorkel stared into the fire, the flickering flames reflecting the storm of thoughts in his mind. He had brought these men to Vinland with dreams of glory, of conquest, and a new life. But now it was clear that the land itself had turned against them. They had come to tame Vinland. Instead, they were the ones being hunted. Thorkel's hand tightened around the hilt of his axe, the pain in his ribs a constant reminder of the battle they had fought, and the battles yet to come. The wolves of Vinland had survived, but they were limping, and the next blow could be their last. Tomorrow they would leave the camp behind. Tomorrow they would fight again, not just against the Skraelings, but against the land, the cold, and the dark forces that seemed to lurk behind every tree. But Thorkel would lead them, as he had always done, and he would not let them fall. Not yet. The pale light of dawn filtered through the trees as Thorkel the Silent led his people northward, away from the camp that had been their home and into the unknown. The air was bitterly cold, biting at their exposed skin, and a thin layer of frost covered the earth beneath their feet. The wounded hobbled along, supported by the stronger men, while others pulled makeshift sleds carrying those too injured to walk. Every step was a struggle, every breath a reminder of how close they were to death. But they moved. They had no choice. Thorkel marched at the front of the line, his hand resting on the hilt of his axe. His ribs still ached from the spear wound he had taken in the last battle, but he gritted his teeth and ignored the pain. He had to. If he showed weakness now, the fragile hope he had instilled in his people would shatter, and with it, any chance of survival. Beside him, Ingvar walked in silence, his face grim and focused. He had scouted ahead and found the ridge they sought, but it was still miles away. The journey would take time they did not have. Sigga trailed behind with the wounded, her sharp eyes scanning the woods as if expecting an attack at any moment. The Skraelings were out there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Thorkel knew it in his bones. This march wasn't just a battle against the elements. It was a race against death. "We're moving too slowly," Thorkel muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Ingvar glanced at him, his voice low. "If we push them harder, we'll lose more men. They're already at their breaking point." "I know," Thorkel said, his tone sharp. "But we can't afford to linger in these woods. The Skraelings will come. They always come." Ingvar nodded, though his face was tight with worry. "We need to get to the ridge by nightfall. It's our only chance." Thorkel grunted in agreement. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like never before. Every decision he made now could mean the difference between life and death for his people. The ridge had to offer them safety, but if they didn't reach it in time... His thoughts were interrupted by a voice calling out from the back of the line. "Thorkel! Ingvar!" Sigga's urgent tone sent a chill down Thorkel's spine. He and Ingvar turned and made their way toward her, weaving through the men and wounded as quickly as they could. When they reached her, Sigga was kneeling by one of the sleds, her hands pressing against the chest of one of the younger warriors, Eric, barely 20, who had been wounded in the previous battle. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale. "He's not going to make it," Sigga said quietly, her voice strained with emotion. "The wound's too deep. He's bleeding inside." Thorkel stared down at the boy, a heavy ache settling in his chest. Eric's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and he looked up at Thorkel, his lips parting as if to speak. "Jarl," Eric rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry. I couldn't fight." Thorkel knelt beside him, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did enough, Eric. You fought with honor." Eric's eyes fluttered shut again, his breath slowing. Sigga continued to press against his wound, but Thorkel could see the truth in her eyes. The boy was already slipping away. "There's nothing more I can do," Sigga murmured, her voice choked with frustration. "We can't save them all, Thorkel, no matter how hard we try." Thorkel closed his eyes for a brief moment, fighting against the rising tide of grief and guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. He had brought these men to Vinland with promises of glory of a new life, but instead they were dying one by one far from their homeland. "We keep moving," Thorkel said, his voice rough. "We honor his memory by surviving." Sigga nodded, though her eyes were filled with sorrow. She stood and wiped her bloodied hands on her cloak before moving on to tend to the other wounded. Ingvar helped Thorkel to his feet, his grip firm on his arm. "We're almost there," Ingvar said, though his voice was tight. "We have to believe that." Thorkel nodded, though the knot of doubt in his chest refused to loosen. They continued to march, the forest closing in around them as the hours dragged on. The woods were unnaturally quiet, the only sounds the crunch of boots on frozen earth and the labored breathing of the wounded. Thorkel's eyes scanned the trees, his senses on high alert. He could feel it in the air, the presence of something watching them, something waiting. And then it came. A high-pitched whistle pierced the silence, followed by a flurry of arrows that rained down from the trees. The first scream cut through the air as one of the men fell, an arrow lodged deep in his neck. Chaos erupted as the Vikings scrambled for cover, their shields raised to ward off the onslaught. "Skraelings!" Ingvar shouted, grabbing his sword and rushing to form a defensive line with the other warriors. To the trees! Shields up! Thorkel's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed toward the front, his axe in hand. The Skraelings moved like shadows between the trees, their arrows flying with deadly precision. They were outnumbered, but they fought with a ferocity that Thorkel had never seen before. The Vikings pushed forward, shields locked together as they advanced toward the tree line. Thorkel led the charge, his axe cleaving through the air as he met the first Skraeling warrior head-on. The man was quick, his movements fluid, as he dodged Thorkel's strike and lunged forward with a spear. Thorkel sidestepped the blow, his axe coming down in a brutal arc that sent the Skraeling crashing to the ground, but there was no time to savor the victory. Another warrior appeared, then another. The trees were alive with movement, the Skraelings slipping in and out of the shadows like ghosts. "We need to break their lines," Thorkel shouted over the din of battle, his voice hoarse with exertion. "Push forward." His men rallied behind him, their shields clashing as they surged toward the enemy. The battle was fierce, and for every Skraeling they cut down, another seemed to take their place. But Thorkel refused to give an inch. His axe was a blur, his movements fueled by desperation and rage. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack faltered. The Skraelings began to retreat, melting back into the shadows of the forest. Thorkel's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion. But he stood tall, his gaze locked on the tree line. "They'll be back," Ingvar said, panting beside him. "This was just another test. They're wearing us down." Thorkel wiped the blood from his brow, his eyes dark and unreadable. "We can't keep fighting like this. We need to get to the ridge now." The men regrouped, gathering the wounded and the fallen. There was no time to mourn, no time to rest. They had to keep moving. As they marched, the ridge finally came into view, a towering rise of stone that jutted out above the trees, offering a vantage point that would give them the high ground they so desperately needed. Thorkel's heart lifted slightly at the sight, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only a temporary reprieve. The Skraelings would come again, and next time, they would bring more than just arrows. "We'll make our stand here," Thorkel said, his voice firm as he led his men up the slope. "We build, we defend, and we survive." Ingvar nodded, though his face was etched with doubt. "And if we fail?" Thorkel's grip tightened on the hilt of his axe as he stared out at the vast wilderness below. "Then we die with honor, as Vikings." The ridge rose before them, a fortress in the making, but beyond it lay the dark, endless expanse of Vinland, a land that had already claimed so many lives. Thorkel knew that the final battle was coming, and when it did, it would determine the fate of all of them. The wolves of Vinland had found their den. Now they would fight to keep it, and Thorkel, wounded but unyielding, would lead them through the storm. The ridge was a fortress of stone and ice. From its high vantage, Thorkel the Silent could see the vast wilderness of Vinland stretching out before him, an endless sea of trees, rivers, and untamed land. The cold wind whipped through the camp, biting at their faces and rattling the crude fortifications they had hastily built from wood and stone. The men worked silently, their breaths heavy, their movements sluggish from exhaustion. Every eye flicked nervously toward the tree line below, where the Skraelings lurked, waiting. Thorkel stood at the edge of the ridge, staring out over the land. His ribs ached beneath the bandages, and each breath was a reminder of the battles they had already fought. His axe, Skofnung, hung heavily at his side, its blade still sharp from the recent skirmishes. Yet even with the victory they had won in the woods, there was no sense of triumph, only dread. He knew the final battle was coming, and when it did, it would be a storm unlike any they had faced before. "They'll come soon," Ingvar said quietly, stepping up beside Thorkel. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. "We've fortified as best we can, but the men are weary. They've seen too much death." Thorkel nodded, his jaw clenched against the rising tide of uncertainty. "We can't run anymore, Ingvar. This is where we make our stand." Ingvar sighed, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. But I wonder if the gods have already decided our fate. The gods decide nothing, Thorkel replied, his voice sharp with bitterness. We make our own fate. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of what was to come. Thorkel's gaze drifted over the men as they worked, their faces grim and lined with fear. They were warriors, each of them, but even warriors had limits. The Skraelings had worn them down, breaking them piece by piece. The Vikings had come to Vinland seeking glory and riches, but now all they sought was survival. Thorkel's thoughts were interrupted by a shout from one of the sentries. They're coming! The Skraelings are coming! The camp erupted into chaos as men rushed to grab their weapons and take their positions. Thorkel's heart pounded in his chest as he ran to the front, where the ridge overlooked the forest below. There, emerging from the shadows, was the Skraeling horde. Hundreds of them, perhaps more, moving like a wave of dark figures through the trees. Their war cries echoed up the ridge, filling the air with a primal, bone-chilling sound. Sigga appeared at Thorkel's side, her bow slung over her shoulder, her face set in grim determination. They've brought everything they have, she said, her voice low but steady. Thorkel glanced at her, his expression hard. Then we'll give them everything we have. The Skraelings surged forward, their warriors darting between the trees, moving with the same silent precision that had haunted Thorkel's nightmares for weeks. Arrows whistled through the air, striking the Vikings' hastily constructed barricades. The first wave hit the base of the ridge, climbing up toward the defenders, their weapons gleaming in the pale light. Thorkel raised his axe high. Hold the line. Don't let them breach the walls. The Vikings answered with a roar, their shields locking together as they formed a defensive wall at the edge of the ridge. The Skraelings crashed into them like a flood, spears and axes clashing against the Viking shields. The sound of battle filled the air, metal striking metal, the cries of the wounded, the grunts of men locked in a fight for their lives. Thorkel fought at the front, his axe swinging in brutal arcs as he cut down the Skraelings who dared to get too close. The blood of his enemies stained the ground beneath him, but the onslaught was relentless. For every warrior he felled, another two took their place, their painted faces twisted with fury and resolve. They're breaking through on the left, Ingvar shouted, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. Thorkel's gaze snapped to the left, where a group of Skraelings had managed to climb higher up the ridge. He cursed under his breath. Ingvar, take men and reinforce that position. We can't let them flank us. Ingvar nodded and rushed off, rallying a group of warriors to hold the breach. Thorkel turned back to the fight, his chest heaving with effort, his muscles burning from the strain of battle. His breath fogged in the cold air, but he could feel the heat of the fight in every fiber of his being. This was what it meant to be a Viking, to face death head-on, to carve out your fate with blood and steel. But even as he fought, Thorkel knew the truth. The Skraelings were too many. His men were too few. The ridge would not hold forever. Another wave of Skraelings surged forward, and Thorkel felt a sudden sharp pain as an arrow struck his shoulder. He staggered back, gritting his teeth against the searing pain, but he did not fall. He could not fall. Thorkel! Sigga's voice cut through the noise, and she was at his side in an instant, her bow in hand, loosing arrows into the advancing horde. You're hit! I'm fine, Thorkel growled, his voice tight with pain. Keep fighting. The battle raged on, the Skraelings pressing harder with every passing moment. The Vikings fought with everything they had, but Thorkel could feel the exhaustion setting in. Men were falling all around him, their blood soaking the frozen earth, their bodies littering the ridge like broken shields. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a blood-red glow over the battlefield, Thorkel realized that this was the end. The Skraelings were pushing them back inch by inch. Skraelings. The ridge would fall, and with it any hope of survival. But even in the face of certain death, Thorkel refused to yield. We stand, he shouted, his voice hoarse but filled with fury. For Vinland, for our brothers, for glory. The men around him rallied, their faces set with grim determination as they fought on. Thorkel swung his axe again and again, cutting down Skraeling after Skraeling, but his strength was waning. The pain in his shoulder was unbearable now, his vision blurred from blood and exhaustion. And then, just as the Skraeling surged forward for what seemed like the final push, a new sound pierced the air. A horn. Not the mournful sound of the Skraeling war horns, but a deep, resonant blast that echoed across the battlefield. Thorkel's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound. There, emerging from the tree line behind the Skraelings, were figures, dozens of them. At first he thought his eyes were deceiving him, but as they drew closer he saw the unmistakable shapes of long Viking cloaks and shields. Reinforcements. Viking reinforcements. "They've come," Sigga breathed, her eyes wide with shock. "By the gods, they've come." The Skraelings, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of fresh warriors, hesitated. The Vikings on the ridge, fueled by renewed hope, surged forward with a roar, driving the Skraelings back. Thorkel's vision swam as he watched the battle shift, the tide turning in their favor. The reinforcements crashed into the Skraeling ranks like a thunderstorm, and the enemy, overwhelmed, began to falter. But Thorkel was fading. The pain in his shoulder had spread, his limbs heavy as lead. He sank to his knees, his axe slipping from his grasp as the world around him blurred into shadow. "Thorkel!" Sigga's voice cut through the haze, and she was by his side, her hands pressing against the wound in his shoulder. "Stay with me, Thorkel. Stay with me." But Thorkel's vision was growing dim. He could hear the sounds of the battle still raging around him, the clash of steel, the shouts of men, but it all seemed so far away now. His chest tightened, but there was no fear in him, no regret. Only the fierce, unyielding pride of a man who had fought for what he believed in, who had led his people to the very edge of the world and carved out a place for them in the harsh, unforgiving land of Vinland. And as the darkness closed in, Thorkel the Silent allowed himself one final thought. We survived. We lived as wolves, and we fought as wolves. Then, silence. Thorkel never saw the final victory, but when the reinforcements broke the Skraeling lines and drove them from the ridge, his people stood tall. They buried their dead, their fallen jarl among them, beneath the stone of the land they had bled for. The tale of Thorkel the Silent, the wolf who led his people into the heart of Vinland, would be sung by skalds for generations to come. Vinland had taken its toll, but the Vikings had claimed their place in history. Thorkel's legacy was one of strength, honor, and unyielding determination. The wolves of Vinland had found their home,